It was supposed to be the perfect life. Emma and I had built our little home on the mountainside, far from the noise and chaos of the city. It was peaceful, just the two of us, with our dog, Max, enjoying the quiet and fresh air. We woke up to the sound of birds, and at night, the stars above us were endless. It felt like a dream. Then came the day our dream turned into a nightmare. It started when the house next door, long abandoned, finally sold. We never thought much of it. No one had lived there for years. But when the moving truck pulled up that weekend, I remember feeling a slight unease, like something was shifting in the air. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the isolation, or the fact that we'd gotten so used to being alone. The new neighbor was a man in his late 40s. His name was Mr. Turner. He didn't look menacing at first glance. In fact, he was polite when we met him. He had a tired smile, a deep scar running along his cheek, but his eyes, those eyes, felt unsettling. They were cold, almost too cold. He seemed nice enough, though, and I tried to ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. At first, everything was normal. We would wave when he passed by, but we didn't have much interaction. That is, until one evening when Emma and I were sitting on our porch, enjoying the sunset. Max was by our feet, wagging his tail. We noticed Mr. Turner standing by the edge of his yard, staring at us. He wasn't just looking, he was watching us intently. I thought it was odd, but I didn't say anything to Emma. I didn't want to be paranoid. Over the next week, things escalated. I started noticing Mr. Turner lurking by his windows, staring at our house at all hours of the day and night. Sometimes, I would catch him standing in the woods behind our house, just barely visible through the trees, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being overprotective of Emma, but it didn't sit right with me. Then, one evening, Emma and I were inside, cooking dinner when we heard a loud bang on the door. I opened it, and there stood Mr. Turner, a nervous look on his face. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice soft but strained. "But I think your dog, Max, might have gotten into my yard. Could you please keep him on a leash?" I blinked, taken aback. Max had always been well behaved, and he'd never wandered off without us noticing. "He's inside right now," I replied, trying to mask my discomfort. "But I'll make sure he stays close." Mr. Turner nodded and backed away, his eyes lingering on me just a second too long before he turned and walked away. Something about his demeanor sent a shiver down my spine, but I let it go. The next day, Emma and I went for a walk with Max, and we decided to take a different route, away from Mr. Turner's house. But as we rounded a corner, we spotted him in his yard again, watching us from the shadows of the trees. His gaze was intense, and when I met his eyes, he smiled, a cold, twisted smile. That night, as we sat down for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Max, usually calm, was barking fiercely at the window, his fur bristling. I got up to check, but there was nothing there, just the moonlight casting shadows across the trees. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing strange sounds from the woods, twigs snapping and leaves rustling, like someone was out there. But every time I looked out, the woods were empty. Things took a darker turn a few days later. Emma had been acting strange. She was tired all the time, her face pale. She told me she hadn't been able to sleep well, but she didn't say why. I assumed it was just stress, but when I caught her looking out the window late one night, her face frozen in fear, I knew something wasn't right. "Emma, what's going on?" I asked, sitting next to her. She didn't answer at first. Then she spoke softly. I saw him. Mr. Turner. He was standing outside, staring up at the window, just standing there. I didn't know what to say. My stomach dropped. I had a feeling something terrible was happening, but I couldn't explain it. That night, Emma and I decided to confront Mr. Turner. We couldn't ignore it anymore. I knocked on his door, and when he answered, I saw the same coldness in his eyes. What's going on, Mr. Turner? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to talk. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with that unsettling stare. Finally, he spoke in a low, almost whispering tone. She doesn't belong here. She's too perfect, too innocent. I've seen what she's become. I've been watching her, waiting for the right time. His words didn't make sense, and the way he said them, like they were a threat, sent a chill down my spine. I took a step back, ready to leave, but as I turned to go, I heard him mutter, I'll make sure she stays with me, one way or another. I couldn't stand it anymore. The fear, the tension, it was breaking us apart. The next day, I told Emma we were leaving, but she refused. She was too afraid, too caught in the grip of whatever Mr. Turner had done to her. I knew I had to do something before it was too late. I was determined to protect her. I waited for him to come back that night, and when he did, I confronted him. I was done being scared. I demanded he leave us alone, that he stay away from our home. But Mr. Turner just laughed, a dark, hollow laugh that echoed in the empty yard. He stepped forward, and I saw his hand move toward his pocket. Before I could react, I saw him pull out a syringe. Too late, he whispered. My heart pounded as I realized what he was doing. He poisoned our dog, Max. In a blind rage, I lunged at him, but he was stronger than I expected. We fought, both of us scrambling and grappling in the dirt, but I finally managed to get a hold of his arm and force him to the ground. The moment I called the police, things seemed to change. Mr. Turner stopped struggling, as though he knew it was over. When the officers arrived, they arrested him without hesitation. They found the poison in his bag and the evidence of his twisted obsession. We never saw him again, but the memory of his eyes, of his whispered words, haunted me. Emma and I left the mountains soon after, unable to shake the terror that man had caused. And as we drove away, I couldn't help but think about how we'd once been so happy, so peaceful, until he came. The mountains were beautiful, but they would never feel the same again. My name is Katie, and I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood. You know the type, cookie-cutter homes, neatly manicured lawns, kids laughing and playing until the sun dips below the horizon. A place where nothing ever happens. That was, until he started standing outside my window. It began with Mr. Meyer, my elderly neighbor, standing in his front yard at night. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just struggling with insomnia, or perhaps he just liked the quiet of the night air. But night after night, I began to notice the pattern. At exactly 2:56 a.m., he would be there, motionless, standing just outside his house, facing in my direction. I thought it was strange, but shrugged it off. Everyone had their quirks, right? But then, it got worse. One night, I woke up with a feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but my skin felt prickled, like the hairs on my arms were standing up. The room was dark, save for the glow of a street lamp outside, casting long shadows across my walls. I turned my head, and my stomach lurched. There, on my front lawn, stood Mr. Meyer. he wasn't just standing on his porch anymore. He was closer, right in the middle of the yard, his face turned toward my window. His eyes were wide open, but there was something off about them. Too wide, too unblinking. I could barely make out the details in the dark, but I could feel his gaze on me, as if he could see straight through the curtains. I froze. My breath caught in my chest, and I fought the urge to scream. There was no way he could see me in the dark, right? I pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore the weight of his stare. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, I told my mom, but she didn't seem concerned. "Oh, Katie, Mr. Meyer's harmless. He's probably just out there getting some fresh air." She didn't understand. Something wasn't right. That night, I kept my curtains drawn, but I couldn't stop myself from peeking through the smallest gap. And at exactly 3:12 a.m., there he was again. This time, he was standing right beneath my window, his face tilted up toward the glass. His eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, were staring directly at me, locked on mine, his expression completely unreadable. I slammed the curtains shut, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. The next night, I set up my phone to record the window while I slept. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I woke up, I checked the footage. At 3:12 a.m., the screen was black. Nothing. But then, I saw movement. I blinked, my blood turning cold. There was Mr. Meyer. But he wasn't standing still anymore. His face was up against the glass, his mouth moving in strange, erratic motions. His lips twitched as though he was saying something, but no sound came through. His head jerked awkwardly, like a puppet on frayed strings, his movements stiff and unnatural. And then, it happened. His eyes darted toward the camera. I could have sworn he saw me watching. But how? I wasn't even sure he knew I had set up the phone. I nearly dropped my phone in panic. And then, it happened. At 3:14 a.m., Mr. Meyer turned his head, violently, to something behind him. It wasn't a slow turn. It was quick, jerky, almost like something was pulling his neck with invisible hands. And that's when I saw it. A shape. A shadow. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize. It was crouched low to the ground, a twisted silhouette barely visible against the darkness. Its limbs were unnaturally long, like someone had stretched them too thin. Its neck was too long, bent at an impossible angle. And its head, God, its head, was cocked to the side, listening. The worst part? It was crawling toward my window. I watched in horror as the thing slithered closer, its body scraping against the grass, dragging itself forward with unsettling speed. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. The video cut off abruptly, and I was left staring at my phone screen in disbelief. That thing had been inches from where I slept. It had been there, outside my window, and I hadn't heard a thing. Shaking, I ran to Mr. Meyer's house. I knocked urgently on his door, my heart pounding in my throat. When he finally answered, his face was pale and drawn, his skin sagging like he hadn't slept in days. "I tried to warn you," he rasped, his voice cracking. "I've been trying to keep it away, but I'm too old now. I can't protect you much longer." I stared at him, confused. What are you talking about? He took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with something darker than fear. It's not human. I've been watching it for years, but it only comes when the windows are open. You have to keep your window shut. Don't ever open it, do you hear me? I nodded, terrified. That night, I stayed awake, my muscles tense, every nerve on edge. At 3:12 a.m., I heard it, the faintest sound. A scratching. It started low, like fingernails dragging across glass. And then, a whisper. Katie. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body was frozen in terror. And then, the worst sound of all, the slow, deliberate creak of my window, sliding open. I felt a cold draft brush against my skin. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I slowly turned my head toward the window, and that's when I saw it. A dark figure. Something standing just beyond the glass, too close to make sense. It was no longer just Mr. Meyer outside. It was them, and they had been waiting. To see if I would listen. To see if I would open my window. And now, I was too late. I'm Mia, and I used to live in the most ordinary neighborhood. Nothing special, just rows of houses with neat lawns and families that kept to themselves. It was the kind of place where everyone was polite, everyone waved, and you could trust that nothing ever happened. But that was before he moved in next door. Mr. Larson was a quiet man, middle-aged, with graying hair and dark, hollow eyes that always seemed to be watching. I never saw him smile. He didn't talk much to anyone, but he never caused any trouble either. My parents thought he was just a little eccentric, maybe a bit lonely. But there was something about him, something that gnawed at me. It started small. At night, I would sometimes hear faint tapping at my window. I thought it was just the wind or maybe tree branches brushing against the glass. But then it started happening more often. Night after night, that same soft tapping sound. At first, I ignored it. I convinced myself it was nothing. But one night, I woke up and immediately felt wrong. There was this heavy sensation in the air, a feeling like I wasn't alone. The room was dark, except for the faint moonlight creeping in through the window. My heart began to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. I turned to the window, and there he was. Mr. Larson. Standing in my front yard. It was the dead of night, and he was standing there, not moving, not blinking. Just staring. His face was turned toward my window, eyes wide open, expression frozen. The moonlight made his skin look almost translucent, his eyes too large for his face. I couldn't look away. My body refused to move, my breath stuck in my throat. Why was he standing there? Was he waiting for something? Or someone? I pulled the covers over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But I couldn't sleep. Not a single minute. The next morning, I tried to tell my mom, but she didn't believe me. Mia, you probably just had a nightmare, she said dismissively. Mr. Larson is just an older man. He's probably up late at night for some reason. But I knew what I saw. And I wasn't about to forget it. The next night, I decided to keep an eye on him. I stayed awake, watching through the crack in my curtains. Sure enough, at exactly 2:30 a.m., I saw him again. Mr. Larson, standing in my yard. But this time, there was something different. He was closer. Much closer. He was standing directly under my window, staring up at it with those wide, glassy eyes. His head was tilted at a sharp angle, like he was studying something in the sky. His fingers twitched, then his hands moved slowly, deliberately, toward the window. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. What was he doing? His face was pressed up against the glass now. I could hear the faintest scraping sound, like his fingernails were dragging across the window pane. The noise sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. I wanted to run, but my body was locked in place. Then, something even more terrifying happened. Mr. Larson's mouth opened. At first, I thought he was going to say something, but no words came out. Instead, I saw his lips stretching in an unnatural way. His mouth widened too far, as if it was unhinging like a snake. And then, with a low, guttural growl, he whispered something. I couldn't make out the words, but I felt the words deep in my chest, vibrating with a malevolent force. They were meant for me. His eyes never left mine, and his hands stayed pressed against the window as though he was trying to push through it. I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed the curtains shut, my heart racing, my head spinning. That night, I couldn't sleep a wink. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl, and I kept hearing that low whisper in my mind, as though it had somehow gotten inside. The next morning, I told my mom what happened, but she didn't take me seriously. You're imagining things, Mia. Maybe you were half asleep and saw something weird. It's nothing. I didn't believe her. Mr. Larson wasn't just weird. Something was wrong with him. Something was very wrong. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I set up my phone that night, facing the window. I didn't expect to see anything, but I needed to know. I needed proof. I woke up at 2:30 a.m. again. My phone screen was still recording, and when I checked it, my stomach dropped. It was him. He was there. But this time, he wasn't standing in the yard. He was in my room. I could see him moving through the video, a dark shape shifting in the corner of my room. My heart nearly stopped. I didn't hear a single sound. He was just there. His eyes glinted in the dim light, staring straight at the camera, and his lips were moving again, but this time I could hear the words. I see you, Mia. I see you now. I gasped, throwing my phone across the room. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped in my own house with this thing moving through the darkness. I ran to my parents' room, but when I opened the door, they weren't there. The room was empty. It was as if they had vanished, leaving nothing but the silence of the house. I was alone. That night, I stayed in my room, too scared to leave. My body was rigid, every muscle tense. The clock ticked on the wall, each second dragging like hours. At exactly 3 a.m., I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from outside my door. Someone was coming closer. Then I heard a voice. Not from the door, but from right behind me. Mia. It was him. Mr. Larson. I turned slowly, but no one was there. Just the darkness. But I knew he was close. Too close. The air grew heavy. The shadows in my room seemed to stretch and twist like they were alive. I could hear his breathing, low and rasping, coming from somewhere behind me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat was dry, my heart thudding in my chest. I heard him again. "Mia, let me in." I spun around to face the empty room. But then I saw it, his hand reaching through the cracks in the wall. His fingers were long, too long, stretching like they were made of something that wasn't flesh. And then, with a snap, they broke through. The walls trembled, and I heard him whisper again, "You should have opened the window." Before I could move, the darkness swallowed me whole.